get a chance to quickly start it on something.
You can hear me? Yeah, you can. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the City Mood Project report. My name's Ian MacArthur, and I'm the director of the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter. And when we launched the charter, we launched the membership tier in January 2020. It was a great time to launch something, wasn't it? I can remember waking up maybe the weekend after we launched it, and there was something on the radio about some sort of virus in China, and thinking, it'll never affect us. And then we know where we were by the 23rd of March of that year. We were in lockdown, and the world changed. The world changed dramatically. And work has changed. The nature of work, the way we work, the expectations of employees has changed dramatically over that period. And in many respects, the pandemic played to the good employment agenda, because many employers out there were going, well, what the hell do we do? How do we manage at distance? How do we manage across the screen? What about this creeping mental health pandemic that we're seeing amongst our staff, the stress it is producing? What about the physical health of people just sitting at home all day? Presented a whole range of issues that we could tap into expertise and share across the network. And one of the issues that we started to look at as we came out of the pandemic was around how people feel when they come back to work, how safe they feel, how confident they feel, how have they gone through that change, and what does that mean for them now as they return to work? How can we help employers get the best out of their staff through that process? And it was with a conversation with Mike that we struck upon the notion of maybe we could take a temperature of the city as it starts to return to work in the autumn. You remember Dine Out to help out, all that stuff. It felt like the lid was being slowly lifted. That was in the summer. We met in September to think about this. We started the project in October, and we surveyed folk for about 6 months across the city, and Mike will tell you more about this, of course, just to take the mood of the city as it returned to work, what was working, what wasn't, what were people's concerns. And Mike will give the details of that work. But it was important for us not just to help employers address the issues that were coming right across the piece, but it was useful for employers themselves to understand and listen to their staff. And that underpins one of the characteristics of good employment. It's about good, meaningful engagement that means listening, active listening, and responding to the employees in your organization. So we've been delighted to work with Mike. Mike, if you want to just move on the slide. So the agenda today, you've had the welcome and introduction from me. You're going to hear from Mike. We're very lucky to have 2 participants, and Mike will join the panel also. Louise Brown from Wigan and Lee, and Claire, I've forgotten Claire's surname. Staines from Open Money, both great supporters of the Good Employment Charter and have been part of the Stride project. Again, Mike, if we can just move on, that's basically, you'll see these slides later, but that's more or less what I said in terms of what we've done and how we've done it. Our delivery partners, as well as Mike, we would have loved to have had Sam Booth here today, but Sam's at home. Hopefully she's online watching us. I'll say hi to Sam. Unfortunately, Sam's come down with a pretty heavy cold by the sounds of things. I think Mike spoke to her this morning, it didn't sound particularly well. So she would have loved to have been here. So get well soon, Sam. But obviously, Pro Manchester have been key in working with us in identifying the right type of employers to engage with on this project. So without further ado, over to you, Mike, and tell us what we found.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ian. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Michael Brennan. I'm a little bit nervous, mainly because I've timed the speech and I assured Ian it was 24 minutes. So I'm going to try and stick to that as best I can. I have practiced this. And there's quite a lot of words in terms of employees and employers and data. So I'm going to do my best to kind of read and look at you and just get the key insights out as part of my journey. So if I make a few blunders, it's only because I'm getting used to speaking into an audience again, but I'll do my best. I'm delighted to be here with our partners at Good Employment Charter and Pro Manchester, because without them, it wouldn't have been possible. But you are in the Manchester Technology Centre, and it is home to two extraordinary businesses. I am biased, they are mine, Toot Toot and Stribe, which I co-founded alongside my friend and business partner, Kieran, and most of the team are around in terms of the journey that's here today. Just set the scene. Our journey began 8 years ago when we developed the world's first app for children and young people to report concerns and ask questions directly to their school or their place of learning from primary through to university. And to date, we've supported over 600,000 children and young people to raise 70,000 questions or concerns globally. And from 2017 to 2019, I was lucky enough with Toot Toot to lead a 300-school independent evaluation in partnership with the Department for Education, which aimed to measure the positive impact that engagement and communication had in terms of technology on young people. And as a result, we developed and led an independent evaluation across 14,000 students, so one of the large independent studies that happened to date in education. And what we found was through the use of our well-being and engagement technology, we were able to increase the confidence of young people to report concerns by 20%. And we were able to increase student happiness as a result of being able to communicate their thoughts when they couldn't do so previously by 17% as an increase. And as part of that journey, as things happen, as when you do good things, people approach you. And we were approached by a local partner in Wigan Council and a national partner in terms of Barclays Bank to develop a technology framework off the back of that study that would support organizations to collect more real-time feedback from their people, particularly from their really hard to reach groups of staff, which, as we'll come on to, became everybody during the pandemic. And after 2 years of product development and research that was led by Lucy Harvey, who some of you may have spoken about already, she's done a fantastic job. We developed an incredibly innovative piece of technology called Stribe, which is underpinning part of this program. And Stribe very simply is a real-time staff engagement and communication tool, which provides anonymous feedback for you to make evidence-based decisions that you can affect change in your organization. As a result of growing these two organizations over the last 10 years of my life, studying, developing, and supporting organizations, I've really, really enjoyed that. And it's kind of a passion for me about being able to get feedback really quickly, offer a solution based upon what people are asking for, and then measure whether that change is effective. And if it isn't, then replace it. And if it is, do more of what you're doing. But when COVID-19 came along, it highlighted to me even further the importance of listening to our people and ensuring that we create a positive working environment which supports the engagement and well-being of our people. For me, these 4 key stats kind of highlight the challenge we're all facing in a modern world of the challenges around engagement and well-being. The first is the rise of remote working. 17% of employees spend the majority of their work at home currently. Some may be more, some may be less, but that's what the stats are saying. Mental health in the workplace. 51% of working days lost due to absence over the last year can be attributed to mental health issues. Work-life balance problems. 60% of employees say they work more hours than they're contracted each week. And keeping teams together. 29% of employees say they're looking for a new role this year, something that we all need to keep in mind as employers. It's also important to keep in mind that the bigger your organization becomes, the more complicated it becomes for your leadership teams to support. And that's a really important stat. The bigger your team becomes, there's more layers, there's more challenges, there's more issues that we need to address and support. But it's not all doom and gloom, because the business case for good employee engagement and well-being is a very strong one. And as you all in this room, you do know that already. And so attributing the kind of positive stats, and these are led by Deloitte, according to Deloitte, the average return on investment for wellbeing initiatives is a £5 return for every £1 directly invested in wellbeing initiatives. However, the average return on investment increases to £8 for every £1 invested if the initiative is embedded and delivers a positive cultural shift, so basically change over time. 60% of employees are actively engaged when they are asked about their mental health on a regular basis, and this comes true throughout the learnings I'm about to share with you. And finally, effective wellbeing initiatives can reduce staff turnover on average by 10% per year, reducing the cost of rehiring and onboarding. They're just really key stats to think about in terms of what you're doing in part of your world. And as Ian mentioned, then came along a little thing called COVID-19 that threw everything up in the air for us all. As I mentioned, I'm really obsessed with understanding how people are thinking and feeling. And so during COVID-19, I developed a framework called the Active Listening and Engagement Framework, which is made up of 3 parts: insights, interventions, and outcomes. And basically, the framework is focused on asking people action-based questions. This is the key part of it. You've got to do something with the question that you ask, and you can't move on to the next question without fixing the first question. And they're designed to trigger that intervention and change, which in turn should positively impact the organization if you create it in a cycle. It's a very powerful framework as it enables you plugging those questions on topics that you care about within your organization, such as well-being, engagement, ED&I, and job satisfaction. It's about that circle and topic that you choose. And if we were to ask a question to your people around well-being, for example, based on their response, you can then target well-being initiatives to specific groups that have responded in that way based on their real-time feedback. And by doing this, you're then able to measure and monitor as to whether the interventions has positively affected the target outcomes, such as decrease in sickness or absenteeism rate. So it's take your topic, ask the right questions, put intervention in place, see if that works, and measure and measure and measure and rinse and repeat that cycle. Don't go on to the next question until you've done that journey with that process. And so during the first year of COVID, as Ian mentioned, I thought, wouldn't it be incredible if we could just measure and monitor how people feel and interact with their employer and their environment as they return to work in the city? And so after some careful thought and planning, I shared my idea with Ian, and to my delight, he thought it was a great one. He backed it and he backed me. And thanks to him, we commissioned the City Mood project in partnership with the Good Employment Charter and Pro Manchester. So going into the detail of the project, the aim of this project was to measure the confidence and feelings of workers returned to the work in the city. There were 6 organisations situated within the city of Manchester that decided to participate in a 6-month pilot project. It was a long project and a lot of dedication for them, so thank you to those organisations. Each organisation nominated 1 representative, people director, HR director, manager, to support the programme setup and delivery. And due to Strive's technology, it made it really, really easy for the work involved to get set up. A series of 4 questions developed in partnership with the Good Employment Charter were pulsed to employee inboxes using the platform 4 times during a 6-month period. And I'll explain that through the journey. And then employees responded to questions in real time. And it's really important that all responses were completely anonymous. There was no way of tracing that back. We wanted the trust, the honesty, and the anonymity outside of the organization to come through. So in terms of a timeline to set the scene, in August 2021, we recruited our partners and advisory board and confirmed questions. In September 21, we introduced the City Mood project to the organizations and set up Strive. In October 21, we launched the City Mood project's first question, and we delivered the same 4 questions 3 more times. So in November 2021, January 2022, and March 2022. And just a point to say a huge thank you to the 6 organisations who volunteered to be part of the City Mood project, which include Trowers and Hamlin, Hall Brown, Anthesis, Manchester City Council, Michael Page, and Open Money. We're delighted to have Claire with us joining the panel today around some of the questions that come through. So as I mentioned, we asked the same 4 questions 4 times over a 6-month period with the intent to measure who will come back into the city. We focused on 4 key themes, which included comfortability of returning to the workplace, the barriers and concerns of returning to the workplace, commuting, and management and leadership response. For each theme, we provided a quantitative question and a follow-up qualitative question that you can see in the structure there, and it's also in your packs if you haven't seen that so far. And because of the Strive technology, what we're able to do was measure basically the qualitative responses against the quantitative. So throughout the framework, what I'm going to do is show you the quantitative data and then give you some evidence as to why people were saying what they were saying in that qualitative insight in a structured way. 2 things that are key for any of these studies to be aware of if you're going to do this in your organization. So in any data collection or gathering of employee feedback, question delivery and the accessibility is key to support an inclusive approach. So if you're an organization that's not just sat in an office with a tech business set up, you've got different offices, you've got different frameworks, frontline staff, think about how you connect and reach with them. And that's really, really important. And as you can see, Strive's got lots of different ways in which you can connect with that. But what we decided to do was opt in for Strive's pulse to email functionality because it was the least friction for employees and least disruptive for organizations on the project. So very simply, an employee would receive the question directly to their email inbox. They could answer that question directly by clicking into that survey without logging into anything, and then they would carry on with their day as if nothing had happened. So it was super quick and simple just to give that feedback without getting any bias around there. And what happened was, as soon as an employee had anonymously responded to the questions, it was saved in real time to Strive's City Mood project dashboard. So it was amazing because we could literally see when people were responding on the days that we sent out how this data came through. So this is just a screenshot of the example data that you can get, but you'll see throughout the format, I'll be sharing some of these insights that came through from the City Mood project anonymously of organizations overall. In terms of the insights, across a 6-month period, 5,219 employees were asked the same 4 questions 4 times. And in the 6-month period, there was a 32% average response rate. Generally a good response rate in my view, given that it was an external program delivered over a 6-month period. So I took the average response rate over time. And so finally, for the next 5-10 minutes, I'm going to share with you the insights from the 4 questions, along with providing some of my own learnings and recommendations. So I'm just going to go through the data slide by slide, and then at the end, I'll kind of summarize these insights. Please don't worry about writing anything down. A lot of this is in your packs, but probably don't read through the pack at the same time, because a lot of the words will be what I'm going through in that journey. So, but it'll just, don't worry about kind of missing anything. It's all going to be in the report that you've got in your bags. So let's look at the first question. How comfortable do you feel about returning to your workplace? Let's make sure I can get my employees and employers right in a different sense. So Send 1 on the left was delivered in October 2021, 18 months after the first announcement of lockdown. So it was little surprise that over 70% of respondents felt very comfortable and somewhat comfortable about returning to the workplace. I think we all did. From the qualitative data, it's clear that large proportions of employees had had enough of working in isolation and from home in Send 1 and simply wanted to get back to the office environment. And where employers had communicated clearly to employees, had ensured social distancing, introduced clear rotas, and enforced mask wearing policies, employees felt very, very comfortable about returning to work. Send 2, however, was delivered in the middle of the winter lockdown, the shock one that came for us. This has meant that some employees between Send 1 and Send 2 had had the opportunity to return to the place of work if their employers had allowed them or indeed encouraged them to. And from the data in Send 2, there was a significant decrease in employees feeling comfortable to return to work, in the workplace. And interestingly, many who had answered in Send 1 as being very comfortable were now responding as neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Upon reviewing the qualitative data, it was clear that having tried to return to office, many employees preferred the choice of working from home due to safety, reduced commuter time and cost, and the ability to have work-life balance, unsurprising. Employees who consistently answered very uncomfortable through Send 1 to Send 4 did so because they overwhelmingly did not feel safe commuting and being with groups of people who were not practicing social distancing. There was and still is a strong feeling that COVID is very much still here and that some employers are now not taking it as seriously as they once did, which we need to be aware of. Anxiety due to working from home for so long and the fear of COVID are 2 very strong factors for many employees not feeling comfortable about returning to the workplace coming through the data. And these are 2 factors I'd really urge you all to think about still, that we're kind of still in this pandemic from a number of employees' point of view, even though this data finished in March of this year. So when asked, why do you feel this way about how comfortable do you feel about returning to the workplace? We've got sentiment of the comments on the left all grouped together, and then we've got key themes. So apologies just because the screen's a bit blurred out there, but again, it's in your packs, but it pulls out the key themes based on how people are saying them. So the larger the words or the different colors of the words is the more people are mentioning those key themes that come through. And what you can see is the sentiment of comments and feedback became more negative over time. From left to right in that top, it dropped down. In the first and second send, public transport, COVID, home, mask wearing, and office were words repeatedly mentioned in comments with a negative sentiment. And despite employees feeling more comfortable returning to the workplace in March 2022 than in November 21, the sentiment of employee comments in March 2022 recorded as the most negative compared to any other time in the City Mood project. COVID, office, people, home, and public transport were all still mentioned. However, there appeared to be an even greater feeling of anxiety and fear within the vulnerable and anxious groups. And these vulnerable and anxious groups sort of self-declared themselves. They were saying they were vulnerable and therefore giving the comments around that. And many kept stating that the pandemic and people's fears should be listened to still and taken seriously. And that was a big theme coming through. Moving on to question 2. Do you feel there are barriers preventing you from returning to the workplace? So in November 2021, which is Send 2 from the left coming in, it was clear that employees felt there were more barriers and a stronger feeling towards the barriers preventing them from returning to the workplace than compared with the data in October 2021 on Send 1 on the left. This was due to 2 reasons. The first was the feeling of anxiousness towards COVID-19, traveling on public transport without people wearing masks, mixing with different groups of people, and a fear of hygiene and lack of health and safety procedures being put in place in the office environment were the main concerns. But the second, and really, really interesting, was that of communication and trust. In Send 2, those that answered yes noted a change in and a lack of communication and, more importantly, consistency from senior leadership compared to what they'd received at the start of COVID-19. So people still were commenting and communicating, but there was a lack of and a drop off in the consistency they were once getting right at the start, what was being bombarded with the comms. It's an interesting point as it alludes to a direct correlation between high and consistent communication levels leading to a reduction in employees feeling there are barriers preventing them from doing something, such as returning to the workplace. Through SEND 3 and definitely through SEND 4, where employees had responded yes, the focus changed to that of working type in terms of flexibility and hybrid as we move through this journey. Where employers were not providing flexibility and dictating without consulting employees on how they'd be returning to the workplace, there was a perceived feeling of a lack of trust. And this kept coming through, this lack of trust based upon those points. And that in turn resulted in an increase in suggested barriers being given by employees, which they perceived would prevent them from returning to the workplace. Some of the barriers were obvious, and some of them were almost made up to prevent them from having to come back into the workplace. And it was relating to the fact that people weren't trusting them. Although the data shows that there was an increase in employees feeling that there were less barriers preventing them from returning to the workplace by March 2022, so that's SEND 4 on the right-hand side, compared with that of November 2021, SEND 2, the levels of employees feeling that there were no barriers returning to the workplace had not fully recovered in line with the response levels at the start on SEND 1. Now, this question directly relates to that of question 1's data, how comfortable do you feel about returning to the workplace? Obviously, where employees felt comfortable returning to the workplace, they naturally also felt there were less barriers preventing them from returning to the workplace. In the follow-up to this question, we asked employees, what can your employer put in place to help you come back to the workplace if reluctant? So through SEND 1 through to SEND 3, a lot of suggestions and opinions were given on how their employer could further support them, which were mainly centered around the office, including rotas for staffing and making that really, really clear from a spatial point of view, increasing cleanly cycles, and enforcing things such as mask wearing in line with the government rules. This was all at the time this was coming through. Public transport continued to be a big concern for those commuting, especially with many continuing not to wear masks. There was also suggestions of employees wanting to continue to work from home post the pandemic as they felt more productive and had more of a work-life balance that kept coming through. It's also noted that there was a balance of positive sentiment in the comments, with many employees commenting that their employer had put everything in place they could to support them. So although we're pulling out kind of the either side, there was a lot of positivity through this. When things were done right, there was a lot of celebration, thanks towards managers in particular, and indeed to leadership that had led that through. Again, in the same way as question 1, the sentiment is most negative in the most recent SEND, which we SEND 4 on the right. Upon reviewing the data, employees with negative comments were either concerned that their employees had just returned to normal, with no real concern for the pandemic, which is still very much in many employees' minds, or that their employer had indeed dictated to them and told them how they'd be working in the office, where they'd be working from, and without any flexibility or choice as part of that process of journey. That consultancy was missing from the employer to the employee. Question 3. It was a really interesting one, as there's not a lot that employers are able to do with the responses directly. However, it's certainly important for employees when thinking about the consequences of these responses and how best to support the employees. Do you feel comfortable when traveling on public transport? Of all 4 questions, do you feel comfortable when traveling on public transport? Question 3 provided the highest negative response consistently across all 4 SENDs. Not wearing masks, overcrowding, poor hygiene such as coughing and sneezing, cancellations, and the ever-increasing cost of commuting led to employees not feeling comfortable when traveling on public transport. So even after 6 months, employees still note those same 5 concerns that they outlined above in the response at the start. You can see from the graph that SEND 4 had returned to similar levels to that of SEND 1, but the concerns are still very much preventing over 70% of respondents to not feel comfortable when traveling on public transport. Now, employees did understand that employers were not able to directly influence the public transport concerns that we mentioned before. However, there was an overwhelming feeling that employers could certainly support employees with some of these concerns through being flexible. So employers who were able to, or indeed chose to be flexible on both working hours and location of work, resulted in employees feeling more comfortable when traveling on public transport. So examples of having the ability to travel either side of rush hour when it's less crowded increase people's feeling of comfortability. It was also noted that through having a flexible approach to location of work and times of working, employees saved money on commuting and at the same time felt more productive, along with stating they ended up working longer hours when not commuting. I will caveat that, however, that it does not mean they were more productive by working longer hours. This data doesn't say that. So, some employers will have done, others will have worked longer hours, but not had the same output that we thought they would in the longer hours. Employees who had worked in an office environment or been a key worker throughout the pandemic felt more comfortable on public transport. However, where there were key workers commenting, it was again noted that the pandemic is not over and that mask wearing, hand sanitizing, and the practicing of social distancing, particularly on busy commuter routes, should still be enforced and indeed reinforced in order particularly to support those two groups of anxious and vulnerable individuals to feel more comfortable when traveling on public transport. So again, just thinking about those insights and the groups that you have in your organizations and how you're supporting them to get to work, to become part of the work, to bring them back into the office if that's the way that you want to do so. So when asked, why do you feel this way? Naturally, employees were extremely negative in their sentiment, the comments, because the quantitative data was also negative. And this correlated with and reinforced the negative qualitative and quantitative responses given to the question. So despite the quantitative data over time showing that employees began to feel more comfortable traveling on public transport between November 21 and March 22, it is clear from the data that those employees who did not feel comfortable traveling on public transport became more concerned and negative with their comments over time. It's clear throughout each send that employees were and became more frustrated with not seeing any change or action to the concerns they were raising. That was a really interesting point, that back to that kind of my action-based framework model. It's all about doing and seeing and making that change happen. And again, there was a challenge that we shared with this program at the start, that we're going to ask the same 4 questions. We're going to feed back to organizations. Some are going to do a good job and some may not have the capacity to reach everybody. So there may not be the change required between these questions. And we started to see that through. That was an interesting point. But one to take away: employees need to see, feel, hear, and be communicated to any change that's happening. And even if you're not communicating the change, if you're not making any change, communicating that you're not doing anything and why is also really, really important in that journey. Interestingly, this question also provided a complete split of opinion over time between those that were generally concerned about COVID and those that were not. And those that were concerned were overwhelmingly negative with both their qualitative and quantitative comments when answering the question. So the final question, and it's actually my favorite question of them all. How engaged do you feel your employer is with your views as you return to the workplace? Employees who feel listened to are nearly 5 times more likely to perform their best work. So continuous communication, actively listening and consulting with employees, supporting employees, and regularly checking in with employees is what leads to employees feeling very engaged on the scale. Between October 21 and March 22, employees who had answered 9 or 10 very engaged to this question did so because they've been consistently been communicated with, consulted with, and felt listened to and supported in all of their qualitative feedback. No surprise, on the flip side of this, employees who answered 1 or 2 not engaged at all to this question were not asked about their views, did not feel listened to in their own mind, and continually felt like they were told how they'd be working, with many outlining that in Send 3 and Send 4, they'd not heard from their senior management in the same way that they had at the start for a very, very long time. You'll see from the graph that Send 1 October 21 was when employees were most engaged. An interesting observation when reviewing the data was that despite more employees feeling very engaged in Send 4 than that of Send 2 and Send 3, engagement levels had still not returned to the higher levels at the start of Send 1. And upon reviewing the qualitative data, it became very clear as to why. And it was back to the consistency, but indeed it was the frequency of employers communicating, consulting, and actively listening to employees significantly decreased between 2 and 3. So that's where this big trend of not feeling engaged and listened to came from, because we stopped communicating at the rate that they became used to at the start of the pandemic, which I found really, really interesting. And a lot of organizations that I speak to tend to say that we over-communicated. The CEO was doing something once a week. Actually, that might have been the right level of communication to reach your people on the front line, as opposed to overwhelming your leaders and managers that see that every single day. When asked the question, why do you feel this way? That final point of the why? The sentiment of the comments and feedback provided the most positive sentiment throughout the City Mood project compared with the other 3 questions. In fact, the first send in October 21, when employees were asked, why do you feel this way? The sentiment of feedback and comments was overwhelmingly positive, you can see at the top. This was again due to employees feeling listened to, feeling supported, and feeling consulted and included in the decision-making. This theme of including your employees on this journey, it keeps coming through. Regular check-ins and communication between management and employees ensured that employees felt like their employer and management cared about them. Back to that trust and that caring element that's so important. However, as you can see from the data, the sentiment, despite staying above neutral, negatively decreased in Send 2 in November 21, compared with that of Send 1 in October 21, with a further drop in March 22. And upon reviewing the reasons as to why people commented negatively, it was clear that these employees didn't feel listened to, they didn't feel supported, and they hadn't been included in the return to work process. There were also interesting correlations in the qualitative data regards to those who answered negatively and didn't feel engaged were also those most likely to have not had a choice in returning to the office, with little flexibility given in working hours and location of work when they did return. Made it. So the so what? What were the learnings and recommendations from this project that I feel are important takeaways for us all to consider, and hopefully something we're going to be chatting about in kind of the panel discussion and wider? Well, for me, the summary is aligned to what I'd thought might happen. And some of this data is probably sitting there going, it's quite obvious, isn't it? But actually, we've got some tangible insights and some graphs that can demonstrate what we're talking about. It's not rocket science, but it's data which confirms that when an employer communicates, consults, and trusts their employees, employees are more engaged and supported to their organization's needs. And when employees do not demonstrate these attributes and behaviors, employees become disengaged and negative. And even if you stop-start, it causes quite a challenge in the organization. So to summarize the report findings, I'm just going to quickly read through the recommendations for organizations to consider, which will just take a couple of minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions and invite Ian back. So looking at question 1, this was a particularly challenging time for employers due to the ever-changing government guidance expectations. It was a nightmare for all of us. It was for me as an employer as well. But communication is key, and you can never communicate enough. This was the so what of it. Employees who felt very comfortable consistently throughout the 4 Sens were those whose employers had communicated regular updates as well in all shapes and sizes, not just one fit all, it was lots of different ways of doing it. And there were 3 groups that continually felt comfortable about returning to the workplace. Employees who knew about the measures their employers were taking to support them to return to the office, so transparency. Employees who had flexibility when traveling, a little bit of trust to be able to get there either side could go a long way. And employees who were given a choice around working in the office or at home with clear guidelines. Now, my recommendation to all organizations is that where possible, consult with your employees about how they would like to work and why they would like to work in a certain way. Your approach, of course, must be balanced with the needs of the organization and your customers, but it also must work for your employees. So I can't sit here and say, oh, whatever employees want to say and do, go and do that. We can't. We've got a business need, an organizational need, a charity need around that. We've got to make sure that's fulfilled. But how can we fulfill that in different ways with the people is something we should really, really think about. And review that. It's okay. It's not a static change. It's once a month, it's once a quarter, it's whatever you can do to manage that journey. In question 2, the more employees feel comfortable with the situation, the less perceived barriers there are preventing them from doing something. Sounds simple. Employees acting with positive sentiment mentioned increased organizational support and effective communication. Employees with negative sentiment commented on their organizations appearing to go back to normal without concern for the pandemic, the sudden stop and off we go again. That's really, really interesting. So communicating as quickly as possible and as consistently as possible enables an employer to proactively manage a situation. So before you do anything, communicate what you're going to do with it, why you're going to do with it, and then measure that change through. That's what makes the difference in people's perception. And employees who are anxious or are fearful of situations can be supported by including them in the process and talking about the perceived barriers of a situation in order to reduce those feelings. So if you've got groups of people and you're wondering why they don't want to come back to the workplace or work in the way you want to, it may be under that kind of layer that they're anxious or they're feeling vulnerable, and we try and get to that point to support them, to see how we can support them going forwards. Providing flexibility on travel time for vulnerable and anxious employees could encourage more employees to travel via public transport to and from a place of work. It doesn't mean we've got to let everyone start at 10 o'clock. It could be that someone comes in at 6 in the morning to miss that rush hour and finishes early if that's what they prefer to do. So it's a bit of a seesaw and give and take in how we do that, but you still get the same time and input based upon the individual. And offering and promoting other travel schemes, such as a cycle to work scheme or a car sharing scheme, were really good examples and practice shared from the City Move project that help people through that journey. And I think one back to the organizations is we put something out there such as benefits, and we think everyone can read it and know it's there. It's about reminding people it's constantly there and going through that journey as part of that support. And finally, question 4, employers need to ensure regular and consistent communication with their employees to enable employees to feel very engaged. Now, everyone in this room is probably interested in that, probably do that, but it's so important to question ourselves, say, are we doing enough in terms of this communication? Because highly engaged employees are 3 times more likely to say they feel heard at their workplace at 92% than highly disengaged employees at just 30%. So if you take nothing else away from today's event, my one recommendation and takeaway would be for you all to review how you communicated with, listened to, consulted with, and support your staff during the start of the pandemic. What was that crisis thing that you did that got that up and moving? And look at what you're doing now and just see where the gap analysis is. Are you communicating enough? Are you over communicating? Is there too many things you're trying to bring back in? Are you overcomplicating it? Are you reaching everyone that you once made an effort to do at the start of the pandemic. That's what I'd really take away in terms of that communication and that connectivity with the people. So thank you very much indeed for listening. Sorry that was sort of at you for hopefully 24 and a bit minutes. But as part of that, really appreciate your views and thoughts. We're going to open the floor to any questions there may be now, and then over to Ian from the panel point of view.
Mike, do you want to take a seat? And can I invite Louise and Claire also to the before we just start with the panel discussion, has anyone got any questions? There are roving mics, I understand, around. Has anyone got any questions just for clarification to Mike about what he did and how he did it? No? Yep, one at the back, great.
We talk. Hello. Yeah. Just in terms of data, I went to something a couple of months ago that was really interesting. It was the Chamber and MMU, and they were talking about the mix of the number of employees in certain sized organizations. I think it was 5% were enterprise, 15% were SME, and 80% were micro businesses, so 10 or fewer. Just, is there a cross view of how that works and whether that affects the data?
I think it would do. I mean, certainly we had Manchester City Council as part of that, and they had about 2,500 of their employees consistently coming through. So half of that data was one from a single organisation. But ultimately, they've got lots of different services and lots of different ways of working. So we took the view on looking at the data as individuals and their feelings based upon their roles, and aligning that to the other organisations that range from 100 employees up to 500. So we tried to get an eclectic mix in this actual project to make sure that we're getting a true representation of SMEs, of MEs in the middle, and then indeed large public sector organisation. It certainly will be a factor to think about, and similar to what the event that you went to, because if you've got large single organizations that are representative of the whole data, that could just be their leadership team that's doing a certain thing right or wrong that could influence projects like this. So I should appreciate that we have to be very careful from a data protection point of view to build the trust of the organization. So what you can do in Strive is you can get lots of demographic data to look at kind of things like gender, ethnicity, location from an ED&I point of view or an inclusive point of view. We didn't do this in this project for speed. We just took email address and then made it completely anonymous. And therefore we just got the individuals. So I agree, in any projects going forward, if we had more time and there wasn't a need of kind of hitting the questions out because the pandemic was moving, I'd certainly like to bring in some other organizations. And I'd like to compare this data outside of the city to see how other organizations are adapting, coping, and seeing whether these line up as well.
Thanks, Mike. Just to bear in mind the context of where we were, because we have forgotten a lot of this stuff quite quickly. I think it's just natural you put it to the back of your minds. But there was the whole debate, actually, when we kicked this off about forcing people back into the office. People were going, right, it's over, right, you're all coming back. And no lessons were being learned, it seemed, in some places. You remember one of the banks said, yeah, it's all over, we're all coming back. So there was very different approaches being picked up. So we wanted to reflect that. I think had we had more time and had the economy recovered a bit more, we would have looked for more sectoral diversity in what we've got. Particularly those sectors where proximity is important to the work, where you've got to be at a machine, where you've got to be in front of a client, where remote working isn't as easy, and that's more challenging. So I think that would have given us a richer stream of data and information that we could have acted upon. But I think we've got on the panel with Louise, we'll actually come to that. But I wanted to start with Claire, actually, because Claire, you participated in the project with open money, and I'd just be interested to get your take on how the project impacted on your staff, but also how you went about engaging and supporting your staff through the early days of the pandemic.
Two very big questions.
They are?
They are very big questions. As I was explaining to Mike earlier, any type of data that we can take and look at changes and look at ways that we can improve our relationship with our people is always great to see. So we were very happy to get involved and see that data, not just from a bigger picture, but also we got our own individual data that we could then act upon, which was really useful. I come from my company is a fintech business. So before the pandemic hit, we were already quite a flexible business. People could work from home. So we were in a very fortunate position that when COVID hit, it wasn't like everybody had to be set up at home. We didn't have to pay for desks. I think the worst thing was, I remember in my car delivering screens to people so people could dual screen. I'm sure people remember those days. And chairs, getting a chair in a Mini is just not a good thing. It just doesn't happen. So from the data, what we did, we looked at different initiatives, and during what I would probably say very similar curve is, I would probably say it was January 2021, where mental health was a real big concern for us. The dark nights were there, people were feeling very lonely. I think everybody felt like Christmas, however you celebrate it, they were just going to get together with people and have that human contact. And all of a sudden, that was just shattered. So people came back in January in a real tough position. And when you talk about mental health, I'd probably say so many people reached out and were really struggling. So things that we implemented is our business owns Work Life by Open Money as well. So we're very fortunate. We have 5 pillars of well-being: environmental, physical, mental, social, and physical. So what we looked was different strategies that would hit each one. So we worked with partnership with Thrive, which is a mental health app. It's approved by the NHS. So we launched that. We worked with Health Shield. For those of you who know, it's a cash plan, and you can get 24-hour GP service, you can get counselling, you can get CBT, and all of that could have been done remotely. And one of the initiatives we launched in February was a step challenge. And at the same time, we raised money for Wood Street. So we split people into teams. They went out, they did steps, and we encouraged that break during the day to get them away from their computer. So there's some of the stuff that we implemented off the back of the survey. Does that cover both questions?
Probably. I was going to ask about the management challenges that you found and how you had to upskill managers through that period, because we talked before about the mentality of presenteeism through this. So maybe your reflections on that.
So what we were talking about before was the mentality that if you can't be seen, you're not working. So how is that measured? So we launched, but we launched a lot actually. I did well then. But we launched our performance management program, which was called Momentum. And it looked at data in regards to how often your team leader, your manager should be in contact with you on a weekly, monthly, and quarterly basis. So we rolled that out with all the leadership team. So ultimately, what we would say is that you need to have a catch up at least once a week for 10 to 15 minutes. On a monthly basis, it's more about the month and the month ahead. And then a quarterly, how are people doing? How do they see the value that they've added? I'd probably say one of the challenges that we're having now is, and I don't know whether anyone else faces this, but you would actually almost find out things when you'd have a cup of tea, or if somebody it wasn't quite right, you'd probably pull someone aside and you go, come on, let's have a cup of tea, let's discuss something and let's go over it and look at whereas sometimes a written word can be a lot harsher and that can be seen. So we've recently had, it's a cameras on policy. So you have your camera on, and wherever possible, use Teams with video as opposed to a written word, as opposed to an email, and look at the way that you're communicating, because different people take different ways of communicating in different ways, if that makes sense. So I hope I'm making sense, but it can be quite harsh. Some people actually took an email of, I need to speak to you in regards to the email you sent out to the customers. People started to have a panic. Whereas if you just dropped a message on Teams, or you just rang someone, have you got 5 minutes? Let's just review this. And I think that's what was missing. And that's, we're still having challenges today. We've not got it right.
Yeah, no, it's a mix that and I think you're right, we're all learning still as we come through this. Nothing's set yet. It feels like it's dim and distant past, because we've been living mask free for what, 4 or 5 months, but things haven't settled yet, and we don't know what's ahead of us either, do we? So we come into the autumn. Louise, you've been, I don't know, you've been an absolute star with us from day one at the Good Employment Charter, and we worked on a bit of a pilot initially with Mike on Strive as we went into lockdown, and just how do we communicate with staff. So you've lived and breathed the dashboards that Mike's tool can provide, and how that's impacted on how you've managed what is a very different type of organisation. Wigan Lee College, multi-site, many different types of jobs within in the organisation. So can you just share your reflections on, you know, how you've used Strive, but also how you've used it as we went through the pandemic?
Yes, of course, very happy to do. The college had invested in Strive. We recognised quite a while ago the importance of employee engagement, and surprisingly, I think quite a few educational establishments weren't quite at that point. Didn't see, not that I'm not saying they didn't see it as important, but hadn't perhaps recognised the investments in that for your business, because ultimately colleges are large multi-million-pound businesses. You know, we've got in the region of 10,000 students, 700 plus staff, multi-sites. It's a complex business. So it was very timely that we'd recognised that. We'd engaged with Michael, the charter, using Strive, and had started to get that underway. And then the pandemic struck. And as a college, yes, we weren't in a position of some of the tech companies, some of the bigger corporate companies, and it literally was on the day, because we kept thinking, they won't shut us, they won't shut us. They'll shut everything else, but they won't shut us. And the day that announcement came through, I was just talking earlier to say it still sends shivers down my spine when I had to send that out to all our students and staff about what was going to happen. And it did at one point look like we were being looted, because I looked out of the window and with staff with laptops and things running down the car park, and I was thinking, oh my goodness gracious me, what are we going to do? So we very, very quickly got up to speed. We're very resilient as colleges, and whilst we had got Teams, we weren't using it to the best of its ability and full functionality. So we very quickly got up to speed with that. But my concerns there was, oh my goodness, the staff, what are we going to do? It's so important, because they were out there, they were teaching students from their bedrooms, if you will. They were safeguarding things. We had all sorts of things to think about. But importantly, I knew how from an engagement point of view, how we had to keep that contact going. So Strive was absolutely invaluable at that point about getting those pulse surveys out. Staff were used to using that, and we could very quickly gather the sense, the feeling of the workforce, and ultimately what was happening out there via them with the students. So there was that side of it, but then there was also the human side of it, because Strive's a fantastic tool, but there's lots of other things and ways of keeping in touch, communicating with people. I remember my dog became very famous very early, because all I could think about what we're going to do. We were doing all sorts of activities, as lots of people were, and we're having online flower shows, baking things, all sorts of things, everything you could think of. And I think talking earlier on about adapting, now, you know, I don't send pictures of my dog out, but well, it's very rare if I do now, and do an online how to bake scones and different things like that. Though we have kept that very important level of communication engagement as we've come back and working back on site, but still with a commitment to hybrid working. You know, the value of the communication there shouldn't be underestimated, though we have shifted it because that was important, because people would be fed up of me and my dog. So yeah, it's worked very, very well. I'm aware of other colleges that perhaps haven't you know, engaged in it because they weren't at the same level as we were perhaps, or have seen post pandemic that let's go back to how we were before. We were catapulted at least 5 years plus forward in our development, both through technology and as an organisation, the maturity of us as an organisation, the trust, how we communicate with staff. And you know, to lose that, I think is quite short-sighted of an organisation if they haven't picked that up and continue to forge forward through these next, which will continue to be challenging years.
Thanks, Louise. I mean, you mentioned the word there, trust. And I think from our perspective and what we've picked up from employers across the city over the last year or so, that's a fundamental word that has developed in organizations that have got this right, that staff now trust and managers now trust staff to deliver. The presenteeism has gone in good organizations, and they understand that they've built that trust through what they've gone through together. And I think one of the reflections, and maybe a challenge to you both in terms of your perceptions on this, COVID was uneven. COVID really brought to light some inequalities that already existed in our workforces, and it actually, you know, it made them worse in other areas, because your workforces aren't all the same. You know, they're different, they're human, they've got different concerns, they've got different physical capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. Through the screens, we all now know the domestic situations that our staff are living in. So, you know, young people typing the laptop on top of an iron board in a shared flat compared to someone who's got dedicated office space. That is something that you now need to take into consideration and think about. But how did you deal with those inequalities? And how do you deal with those inequalities in the workforce as you return to work? Because clearly some people needed to get back to the workplace. They needed that social interaction because they didn't have the space at home, whereas others were way more comfortable. So that unequalness, how do you deal with it? Who wants to go at that one?
I'll have a go at that one. Yeah, definitely disparities across different groups of staff, and for us we've got academic staff, student facing staff, back office functional staff, site staff, you know, with a lot of different groups, and it is about knowing your staff, knowing your workforce, and the glue to all that for me is your management team. That those leaders are the glue in the organisation that ultimately know within their teams who's struggling, who isn't struggling, who has got the resources and the facilities needed. And you know, by understanding, if we're talking, if we part the academic staff for a moment and focus really on the functional staff, it's knowing within those teams who's desperate to get back into the workplace, who for a number of reasons is very anxious, you know, they could be vulnerable, and looking at how you work across different functions. Don't operate your teams as silos, because there could be somebody in that team that's absolutely desperate, is in a shared house with 6 other people in a room and hasn't got the privacy and things that they need to work. Yet we've got people who are either clinically vulnerable or very anxious, are really struggling and getting back into the workforce, and looking at how we use our resources spread across. We did that quite a lot, and the constant communicating and understanding how the workforce are feeling gave us some information from different departments for us to look at that. So that was one way we sort of approached that. Ian.
Claire, have you got any reflections?
Well, very similar in the fact of it's all about communication for us. So I think that's the theme that's come from yourself today, Mike, is it's about communicating, and that there's not one rule that fits everybody. I know certain people communicated with their, with their tech lead, look, if there's any calls, can it be between 12 and 2? Because it means I can have the dining room table and then I'm not in my bedroom. So there was, a variety of different things. Whenever we could open the office, we opened the office. And at this time we were at WeWorks and it was open 24/7. So whenever we could, we would allow people to go back in, just so they had somewhere to go. I know a lot of people felt like, I know sometimes people love the fact that they work from home, but they wanted that brain space in order from the commute from home to work, just to almost switch off before they then got into work. So yeah, there was no real, like, this is the rule. It was, we took it each individual as we could, and we're very fortunate that we do have a good leadership, and we want them to be honest with us.
And there's ways of building in some of those more innovative ways of communicating. We had an example of, I think it was called meeting bingo, where everybody put to a central coordinator that they were up for a water cooler moment that was missing at the moment. And you got a Teams invite, and so did 5 other people that you'd never met in the organization before. And you met for 15 minutes and you went, I'm here and this is what I'm doing. And that just built that kind of social capital across an organization that was missing at the time. And another way of just taking a pulse in a very informal way. Look, we're hard against time, so we wanted to finish at 1:30 so that you had some time to network before you head back to whatever you're going to do. But before I do that, is there any other questions for Claire, Louise, or Mike? Please.
Hiya, is that working? I was just wondering how you managed the hybrid team and how you kept that dynamic of collaboration and sharing and just kind of almost those water cooler moments going when, especially when you were fully remote, but then now you've got your team, some are in, some are working remotely. I mean, potentially some aren't even based in Manchester, with some of, certainly with your fintech organization. I don't know about yourself, Louise, but how do you manage that kind of maintaining that collaborative team dynamic?
Do you want me to go first? Oh, yeah. It's not easy. So this isn't easy, and it is evolving. And the reason I'm smiling is because during COVID, we did a PowerPoint every week. And then the feedback was, we're sick and tired of PowerPoints. We don't want PowerPoints anymore. And now recently, where are the PowerPoints? Where's the updates? Where's the PowerPoints? I'm like, okay, so it's a constant just listening. We have done a variety of different initiatives. So we have a charity and social committee, and one person from each area is part of that charity and social committee. So we hear what everybody wants, and we have a get together once a month. People can come in, or we ensure that it's online. So it is still hybrid. We have 3 main events a year, and one every 4 months. We've got a crystal ball just before Christmas, which is where we would never force anyone to come, but we normally get a good turnout. It tends to be either sickness or childcare or something else as to why they wouldn't come. People tend to want to engage and want to come along. We have stand-ups once a week. So every single team has a stand-up for 10 to 15 minutes once a week. We have the momentum. And then we have a variety of ways to communicate. So anything that we do is always online and it's always recorded. So for those people who've taken advantage of flexible working, condensed hours over 4 days, they can watch that back and ask any questions. We have newsletters now that goes out, so people can read that at their own time. We have different clubs. So we have EA clubs, we have a chess club, we have a football club. We've got it's been changed to outdoors now. It was running, then walking, then climbing. So we just went, it's an outdoors club. So they climbed Snowdon in September, and they're doing another walk in October, and people just come up. So
You said they, not you.
No. Oh my God. Childcare problems. Otherwise I would be on the top of that mountain. I've done it once, never again. But yeah, so it's for me, it's always been about listening, and if we can do it, we will implement it. And if it trials and fails, try a different way. And if it doesn't, but constantly evolve it. What worked 2 years ago doesn't work now. And we have 3 different business areas with a variety of different ages, a variety of different personalities. And it's just a case of just trialing it and see what we get. We did I'm very proud of this. We did our recent Compass survey, which measures the engagement. And in August, we got the highest score we've ever had since we started. So don't get me wrong, we've got a long way to go, but we're doing some real positive things. Yeah.
Very briefly, just quite similar really, though we're very different organisations. And I think one of the key things is to keep reinventing yourself and to know those individuals. So whilst, you know, to some degree, when everybody was pretty much working at home, it was a little bit simpler. Now you're with the hybrid approach, we're very much about getting staff events, staff development opportunities, making sure they're planned in, everybody knows when they're happening, encouraging everybody to come in, asking everybody to come in. Quite frankly, for some of those things, it's very, very important. And then if there's individuals, we'll deal with that separately outside of that. Large scale events, we've started doing them again. Similarly, we had a staff celebration event that was fantastically attended. I think staff was so happy to be able to come back together as a large group. There was cocktails, mocktails, all sorts of things going on. And we're planning a Christmas one as well. But we do still do things like the virtual coffee morning, the drop-ins like that. Lots of charity events, staff enrichment, we refer to it. We've got lots of those similar clubs going. Recently, you know, we've done charity runs, not quite the marathon, we did 10K. But lots and lots of activity about that, bringing us together for a greater cause, if you will, both joining staff and students in that. So yeah, it's just reinventing itself, but you know, making sure that you're not applying any blanket approach, because there'll be different pockets differently affected by that.
Ian, can I add one point?
Yeah, of course.
Literally, it's personally as a leader, I'm quite input driven. And actually what helped me is running a small team, and the team are brilliant around me anyway, but was moving to outputs. So actually think about the kind of what you're trying to achieve here before you then go out to your team. So the so what, we're going to get here at this point, what needs to happen, and you as a manager or a leader being aware of that bit, and then giving your team the trust and ownership of how they're going to get there. That's really hard if you're not used to that, and I struggled for quite a bit, but it's really, really invigorating to now have that conversation of the blockers are coming to me or to the team, or why are we not getting someone to talk about that? It doesn't matter whether you're working at home or in the office, everyone's aligned to that time frame, that plan. It's about, I think, managers actually just being a bit more, give themselves more time to prepare and actually get that structure in place, that then everyone else can kind of fall in and agree with that as part of that journey. That'd be my advice, of that kind of outcome number rather than.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I think that comes back to the trust piece as well, doesn't it? About, doesn't matter where you work, when you're working, but as you're delivering the output, that's the important thing. Just another reflection about that hybrid working. I think it's a challenge to everyone, is how do we make sure that opportunities exist for everyone in our organization through that? And that's something that managers need to be mindful of, and not judgmental about those that are in the office are going to develop and progress, whereas those that are at home are, this horrible term, quietly quitting. They're not. If you know, it's the Rees-Mogg mentality of you can only work when you sit behind a desk in a certain place. And it's, you know, a challenge for management to recognize potential and development opportunities for all your staff, not just those that come into the office. That's our time, I'm afraid. I just leave you with a bit of fun. That we've got a QR code up here while you're mingling at the end. If you just want to click on the QR code, and we'll ask yourselves a question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your employer, and why do you feel this way? So again, all responses are completely anonymous, but we'll share this on social media perhaps afterwards, Mike, just as a bit of fun, and you can see how the technology works directly. if you could join me to thank Mike, Louise and Claire for their contributions today, but also to Pro Manchester for helping facilitate today's event. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
There's still plenty of sandwiches and
Thank you,
there's
guys.
drinks and things out there for
Brilliant.
networking, so
Good.
you're more than welcome to be outside there.
Thank you, Mike.